Hello, Paul.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Lit up in the bright lights of the ABC today, Catherine Feeney, fresh from her appearance on The Project last night. That lady, honestly, between Kat on The Project, you on The Project, you're a media star at the moment. Such is the appetite for your expertise, Paul, and you never know where the questions are going to come from.
Absolutely.
Like the director of the National Archives of Australia saying, lick a stamp, put it on the envelope, and then immediately backtracking going, oh, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't be licking stamps. Is it okay to lick a stamp?
Yeah, I think if you're licking your own stamps and someone else isn't licking it, you're probably going to be okay. I mean, I think if you can wet the stamp with an alternate source, maybe some water on a finger, for example, that might be better. But I think as long as no one else touches it immediately after you've licked it, that'll be okay.
Little sponge on the side?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I do love the idea that someone might have just flicked their radio on or jumped onto Facebook Live just to hear you say, lick your own stamp and don't lick anybody else's stamps. Okay, that's just a metaphor for life, really, perhaps. Let's go to Donald Trump, the US president, who has revealed that he is consuming hydroxychloroquine. This is the drug that we've talked about before, unproven in its treatment of coronavirus. You said at the time there needs to be more investigation done. Just what does hydroxychloroquine do to you if you just take it in a preventative way?
So it's a medicine we use for quite a few indications, particularly some inflammatory disorders like lupus, for example. And it's not a new medication. We've used it for a long time for that, as well as to do with malaria. And I have a few problems with this situation, unfortunately, because we've got some evidence to suggest it might help, and that's certainly justified using it in more trials to try and prove that that's the case. And these days we want things to be evidence-based, because any medication is not without risk. And unfortunately, the trials so far have probably suggested that the risks outweigh the benefits at this point in time. It probably doesn't work as much as we first thought, and the risks are very significant. So then a prominent figure like this to go ahead and use it, I think sends the wrong message. And I think his own scientific and advisory staff has suggested not to do that. And then him using it sends a really contradictory message. And I think at this time people are struggling to find the right information and what to do. And then when someone like this uses that medication outside of what we think is acceptable, a lot of other people then get very confused and want to get it. And it's not a zero harm intervention, people using this inappropriately, because then people that need it for recognised indications struggle to get it. And we are going to see side effects.
And what is it? It's anti-malaria medication?
That's right. It's predominantly an anti-malaria medicine, but it also has some anti-inflammatory properties. I think that's where some of the antiviral effects in this case were thought to maybe come from. But people that have some inflammatory conditions need to take this every day. And if they can't get it because of this, that's a big problem.
Are you surprised that Donald Trump is taking it?
I think we've seen a number of things we'd like to be surprised by from Donald Trump, but I think it's a pretty consistent behaviour now, so not necessarily all that surprised.
Very diplomatically put, Paul Griffin. What is he risking by taking hydroxychloroquine?
So the side effects include things like arrhythmias or funny heart rhythms, other heart problems, problems with your vision, and then other organs as well. So, while for those indications that we have evidence for, the benefits outweigh those risks, for this, where we think the benefit is minimal, if any, and the risks still exist, we think that at this stage the risks outweigh the benefits, and certainly using it in a clinical trial context is justified, but outside of that I'd recommend against it right now.
And as you say, when a person in a position like President of the United States advocates something, it does have trickle-down behavioural effects, even here in Brisbane. I've got this from a bloke who was in a pharmacy yesterday. He wrote to me saying, I was getting my flu shot when a man in his late 60s was asking the pharmacist why he couldn't get any hydroxychloroquine and needed a script. He said, Clive Palmer's donated millions of doses, why can't I get any? He told the pharmacist it would clean the body of the virus in 24 hours. The poor pharmacist. Do you think this is what's going to happen? And is the right response from pharmacists to say, no, you can't get this at this stage?
Yeah, absolutely. So those claims would be grossly exaggerated, even in the best case scenario, if we do prove it has some effect. So it's a medicine that's still under investigation for both prevention as well as treatment, but at this stage it's certainly not for widespread use. It's not something you can walk into a chemist and get for coronavirus. And as I said, we need to keep it for the people where we know it works, those people with those inflammatory conditions, and it needs to be given by a doctor in that case, and outside of that, clinical trials is certainly acceptable to get more information, but outside of that, not at all.
If you've got a question for Dr. Paul Griffin, you can call now 1300 222 612. He is the Director of Infectious Diseases at the Mater Hospital. You can also send your question by text 0467 922 612. I can tell you that at the moment on the text line, Paul, I'm just being bombarded with people saying you don't lick postage stamps anymore, they're self-adhesive. That shows how recently you and I have written letters. Alan's called in from the Sunshine Coast. Alan, good morning. What's your question for Paul?
Good morning, Beck. Good morning, Paul. My question is, I've had the 70-year-old plus vaccine for pneumonia. Is that of any assistance with COVID-19 if I was to contract it?
The short answer there is no. So a great thing to get that vaccine, and certainly does help with pneumonia in people that are vulnerable, but that's actually for a bacterial organism that causes pneumonia and has no effect on the coronavirus. So at this stage, there's no vaccines available for widespread use that will help, but obviously there's lots of work happening to try and have that happen soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. 1300 222 612. You can call now if you've got a question for Paul. If you're on Facebook Live, there's a live video feed right now. Pop your questions on there and I'll put them directly to him. Just while we are on a social media platform, there's a virologist on Twitter, Ian Mackay, who's been fairly vocal throughout this pandemic. And he said yesterday, why is it so hard to grasp that infection and disease are two distinct things? Can you explain the difference between infection and disease?
Yeah, look, it is a little bit of a complicated one. And basically there are lots of, particularly viruses, that can actually infect people, so enter their bodies through a variety of ways and not cause much disease. So a disease is where you have a problem basically caused by that agent. So, there are lots of the glandular fever viruses, for example, that a lot of people have had, but they may not have never known about it. And in the coronavirus as well, there are people potentially that have had it but not had any symptoms. So they've got the virus, they've got the infection, but not had the disease, the COVID-19, where they get all those symptoms. So that's why the two often are closely related, but not necessarily 100% of the time.
Okay, so it's a flow-on effect, virus, then infection, then disease?
That's right.
Potentially,
yes.
But not necessarily.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, and thanks, Ian Mackay, for raising that question. Just back to the US, there has been a major breakthrough in the early trials of a COVID-19 vaccine. What can you tell us there? So
that's the Moderna vaccine. So they've got a really interesting way of making vaccines, and I've actually worked on some previous vaccines with that company, and it's great to see. I've said a few times now that any results of any vaccine trials, even if that's not the vaccine that moves forward, will help the rest of us in terms of vaccine development, so it's great to see any results. But I'd caution people over-interpreting this. It's small numbers, it's proven safe, and they've got some antibodies, and we call that a correlative protections. It's not proof it's working. It's a step in the right direction, but we need lots more work on that one first.
What is the hardest part in the development of a vaccine?
It's a really difficult process, and the majority of vaccines that get to the early stages don't make it through because we need to have, these days very understandably, there's a really rigorous regulatory environment around this. We need to have evidence at every step before we can move to the next step. So, for example, to give it to people for the first time, we need to have lots of data that suggests it's likely to be safe and effective. So we need to get all of that. There's lots of independent reviews, for example, before we're allowed to progress. So, it's a rigorous regulatory environment to make sure that things are as safe and as effective as we think they are, and that's all there for good reason, but it does make it take time.
I'm still getting lots of texts through about stamps and the fact that they're adhesive. Thank you, noted. Paul and I appreciate that, although Jim says you still have to lick $2.20 stamps, so, there's always exceptions to the rule. But let's just park the stamp conversation, take advantage of the expertise in studio. Paul Griffin here to answer your questions. He's an infectious diseases physician and microbiologist. Dee's called in from Wynnum. Dee, good morning. What's your question for Paul?
Good morning, Beck. I suffer from factor V Leiden, a heterozygous type, which is a blood clotting disorder, Beck. Does that make me particularly susceptible to COVID? Because I believe I read somewhere that it does cause clotting in the lungs or something or other.
Yeah, good question. So that's not a condition that's recognised to be a risk factor at this stage. I'd always encourage people, if they have questions like that, to be individually assessed by whoever looks after that to make sure it's managed as well as possible and specifically address those questions. But that's not one of the things that's recognised at this stage as being a big risk factor. The main thing really is age. That's the main independent risk factor. There's a slight sex differential, so men unfortunately are a little bit more likely to get severe disease. And then other comorbidities like diabetes, heart disease and lung disease are the big things that are standing out at this stage.
Stay well, Dee. Thank you. Peter from Alderley says, if the immunisation for COVID-19 is less than ideal, could two of the best candidates be used to hit the virus from different angles? For example, injection and nasal immunisation.
Those sort of things are certainly possible and will be looked at. A bit too soon to comment on that. I mean, what we hope is that we have the ideal vaccine to be one that's a single injection and protects you almost 100% forever, but it's unlikely we'll get one that's quite that good. So we might have to do novel things like combining approaches and that sort of thing. So it's possible, but too early to say for sure yet.
Queensland's Chief Health Officer, Dr. Jeanette Young, has said 42 Queensland cases of COVID-19 have no traceable source. How do we find out how they got it?
We probably won't. So the first thing to say is that's a really low number relatively and reflective of all the great work the public health teams have done in tracing the source of all of the other cases. So what probably happened there is those people had an unknown source and it could have been a contact somewhere or something like that. I guess this is where the COVID Safe app was designed to help with those sort of things as well. So we see fewer of those unknown cases. But in the end, that's reflective of a lot of good work to keep that number as low as it is. And we probably won't know for sure about all those, but I know the public health teams are working really hard to track down as much as possible.
Bit of a discussion about the COVID app popped up this morning as we were talking about the Qantas boss saying, look, we want planes flying again. We won't be enacting physical distancing on the planes. We won't be blocking out that middle seat because it's just not financially viable. And then people were saying, is the COVID app going to work when you're up in the air? What do you think in terms of airplanes and people sitting side by side? Is that a safe path to head down?
Look, I think there's going to be a combination of mitigation strategies that people have to employ every day of their lives for a few years yet. And I think making sure, for example, the best one is that if anyone's sick, they don't fly. So if you're due to fly and you've got any symptoms potentially consistent with COVID, then cancel your trip and stay home and stay in isolation and get tested. So then we'll find out if that's what you indeed have. I think then hand hygiene, maintaining physical distancing as much as practical, and all those simple things will go a very long way to reducing that risk. And I guess the other thing to say is that a plane, we know where people were sitting, so if we get a case, then we do already have access to that information to track who they might have come in contact with.
Yes, Georgina's followed up saying, is there medical research regarding your chance of an infection on a flight?
Those sort of transmission things are always looked at, and we're still, working really hard to fully understand how far COVID can go and what sort of risks there are. So we typically will look in proximity because it's not airborne. So that's one of the things that separates it out from some of the nastier bugs where we have to contact trace a lot more people. So it's not something that typically goes through the air conditioning of the plane and infects everybody. It still needs to be people in proximity relatively.
So someone's got a cough on you and a wet droplet's got to land on you, and then you've got to somehow ingest that, right?
That's right. So
yes.
Usually it's through direct contact or touching a surface with it on and then touching your face somehow. So again, if you're doing your hand hygiene really well, that takes that method of transmission really out of the equation.
Wash your hands. Inevitably, this conversation comes back to washing your hands. It's 10 minutes to 10. You are listening to ABC Radio Brisbane, maybe on your radio, maybe on your television on Channel 25, or maybe on Facebook Live this morning, which is where you can see Paul Griffin, the Director of Infectious Diseases at the Mater Hospital. William says, I'm a Brisbane bus driver. As Queensland's not limited the number of passengers on our buses, are drivers at risk? And should he wear a mask going forward?
The wearing of masks in the community remains a bit controversial. I know some countries are advocating very strongly for mask use, but really, if you're doing the other things well, the mask probably doesn't really help you. And in some people, it gives them a false sense of security, so they stop doing their hands well and actually might put them at risk, as well as if they don't change it regularly or wear it properly. So short answer on masks, I'd say, broadly speaking, I wouldn't recommend that. But if you do your hands well and don't get too close to people, which I imagine is the case for the drivers, then they should be fine.
Ross says, I understand that the current COVID virus has already mutated, according to scientists. Given that most viruses do mutate, will the current vaccine become ineffective?
Good question. So, we have found a lot of changes. Those are really at a research level now. So a lot of those changes, we can sort of see where they are in the genetic code, but we don't know the impact of those, whether it makes it more or less virulent or infectious, for example. If we do see significant strain changes over time, that might inform our vaccine production. And again, we might have 2 strains in a vaccine eventually. At this stage, we've seen no changes that make us think the current vaccines are unlikely to work, but that might be something that happens in time.
Great. Ross, thank you. Jenny says, how dangerous is mail? We are immunocompromised. We wipe everything down that comes into the house. What's the best way to protect against the virus settling on paper, cardboard, plastic?
So it probably only lasts a day or two maximum on those sort of things. So by the time it's gone through the process of being transported, I would think the risk is exceedingly low. So the routine wiping of things coming into the house is probably not necessarily required, because I think that avenue of transmission is very unlikely. And again, if you keep doing your hands well after you've touched a whole lot of things, that method of transmission also will be very unlikely.
Yeah, but lots of people are doing online shopping, a lot more packages being delivered. You would think that the hygiene levels are high of the delivery drivers, maybe even gloves or certainly hand sanitizer, because they'd be wanting to protect themselves as well. Just a note on hydroxychloroquine. Someone's texted saying, I was a nurse working in the tropics and hydroxychloroquine stopped the production of my red blood cells. After 1 year, I'd become grossly anemic.
So they're the sort of side effects that can happen. So yeah, it's not a zero harm intervention. There are side effects with all medications, and so we only recommend using them when we've got evidence the benefits outweigh the risks, and we're just not there yet.
Somebody better tell Donald Trump. Deb Kilroy was a guest on Steve Austin's Drive show yesterday. Deb contracted coronavirus, and we spoke to her a number of times throughout her illness. She is still feeling the effects of COVID-19. Here's what she told Steve.
My initial symptoms was nausea, body aches, headaches, then a bit of a sore throat. But since I've come home, because I didn't really think about it, actually, that it would be ongoing, and I don't think anyone has, because It's been like a life-death situation. You either pass away, die, or you're not infectious anymore and you're released, so you don't have it, you didn't die, so you should be able to get on with it. And it wasn't until I read an article by Dr. Paul Garner from the UK, an infectious disease doctor, that gave me this great sense of relief, that people who've had the virus have these ongoing symptoms.
Deb Kilroy with Steve yesterday. Last night on the 7:30 program, a series with a whole bunch of people of various ages who, months after contracting COVID-19, were still extremely fatigued and unwell. So we're still learning about this.
Absolutely. I mean, we know with a lot of very significant viral infections, a small proportion of people will have those fatigue-type syndromes afterwards. So I usually explain this to people with the glandular fever-type viruses. Everyone knows one person who got it worse than everybody else and had to spend a few months recovering. And, any significant infection can have a fatigue syndrome essentially afterwards. So it's not surprising this happens. I guess the main thing is it's not the majority of people. It's pretty rare, just like the severe manifestations. Most people recover from this pretty quickly, but it can happen.
Dick has called in from Taroom. Morning, Dick. What's your question for Paul?
Well, I'm not too sure whether you've covered it because I've only just walked in. But I've been wondering about air conditioning lately. Can it travel in air conditioning?
In homes, in offices? I mean, we talked about it on airplanes.
Yeah, good question. The short answer is no. So airborne viruses that are smaller particles can be recirculated by air conditioning. Droplet transmission sort of things like this one don't get it into the air conditioning and spread that way. So that's reassuring.
Great question, Dick. Thank you. I thought we were going to be back at stamps there for a second. I can tell you I'm still getting text messages about stamps. We got it! Tucker in Maruka. Morning, Tucker. He says, I heard the medicine called Avignan, or Avigan. Am I saying that right? Avigan. It's produced in Japan, he says, my country. I've heard that it's quite efficient for coronavirus. What is it? Is it available in Australia?
So at this stage, we have no approved therapies for coronavirus. We've got lots of clinical trials, hundreds in fact, of all sorts of different medications that are being used in a clinical trial setting to try and see if they work. But there's still no approved therapies. But as I said, lots of trials are ongoing.
Have you heard of that Avigan in Japan?
Not specifically. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. But there's lots of medicines being trialled. Hopefully we'll find something soon.
Billy from Bribie Island says, do you think there will be a second wave?
I think the main thing to say about the predictions from here is that we control what happens. So a few months ago, we were predicting a lot more cases, but we were able to control that through all the interventions that have been applied, and we've done a spectacular job with that. So really, that's up to us. I think if we get complacent, relax too much, we'll see lots of waves and big spikes and things like that, but we hope to be able to control that. And what I actually predict, given how well people are handling this, is that we'll see small numbers bob up here and there, but given that the tools we've got available, COVID Safe, the public health, the access to testing, we'll be able to clamp those down fairly quickly so that they remain fairly small.
Should the Queensland borders stay shut?
It's a tricky one. I think there's a lot of different things that need to be considered for that. I think our control is getting so good that it can certainly be considered. But again, if we relax everything too quickly, then we won't know what it was that made a difference if we see a big spike. So I think it needs to be done in a stepwise, very considered fashion like we're seeing. So I think we're getting close, but we'll see.
Always good to talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Paul, I don't know if you're aware, but stamps are self-adhesive these days. You don't have to lick stamps.
Duly noted. Thank you very much.
On ABC Radio Brisbane, you're listening to Rebecca Livingston.
I just love that the world's stamp experts have all tuned in this morning and we have such brilliant advice. Thank you to everyone who